Thank you.
ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ ๆ Welcome to the Peak of the Week Bible study. Sort of. I'm actually on vacation this week. But this video is going to stand in for our regular streaming Bible study in the Gospel of Mark. Now, we'll finish that study on March the 12th. We'll wrap up the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16. We're basically going to get our marching orders from Christ. Then on March 19th, all of those who are planning to be a part of our small groups, and we want to encourage everyone to get involved with a small group. We will meet at the building to discuss group dynamics, study topics, times, locations, and you can ask questions about which group would be best for you, what times, what days, all of that stuff, what the study topics are going to be, what the purpose of the group is going to be. So we want to encourage everyone to be a part of that. Now, I'll be out of town this weekend. So the next time I see you will be online next Wednesday evening, March 12th, in person as we finish up Mark. And then, Lord willing, the following Sunday, I'll be back in the pulpit. I specifically chose tonight's study because it's vital to Christian doctrine. The evidence of the resurrection of Christ. Listen, Christianity stands or falls on that one truth. If Christ is not risen, our faith is vain. But if he is risen, it changes everything. So I pray you have a great week. I'll be back next Wednesday evening. God bless you, and I'll see you then. Welcome to the Preacher Online. Today, we're diving into one of the most pivotal topics in all of history, and that's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Is it just a story, or is it historical reality with eternal implications? By the end of this episode, you'll not only see the overwhelming evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, but also understand why this event changed everything for the world and for you personally. We're going to explore the empty tomb, the eyewitness testimonies, and the profound transformation of those who encountered the risen Christ. We'll also address the skeptics and the alternate theories and reveal why they fall short of explaining what really happened so very long ago. Stick with us to the end, and you'll discover how the resurrection is not just a fact to believe, but an invitation to live a new victorious life. And if you're ready to take that next step, we'll actually show you exactly how to respond to this life-changing truth. So don't go anywhere. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications right now so that you never miss an episode. And while you're here, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what questions you'd like to talk about in future episodes. Welcome to the Preacher Online. Let's get to work.
The Preacher Online.
Now, the first thing we need to look at is the empty tomb. The empty tomb stands as a foundational piece of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is one of the most well-documented facts in the gospel accounts, and its implications are profound. There are historical facts that are connected to the burial of Christ. He was buried in a tomb that was owned by Joseph of Arimathea, who was a prominent and respected member of the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin. In Matthew 27, verses 57 through 60, that passage records that Joseph, who had become a secret follower of Christ, courageously went to Pilate to request Jesus' body for burial. Now, that's significant because Joseph's high standing in Jewish society made him a well-known public figure. His involvement provided credibility to the burial account, as any false claims about the burial could easily be challenged by those who knew Joseph or his associates with the tomb. Additionally, the fact that a member of the Jewish leadership, many of whom were hostile to Jesus, still took responsibility for his burial, and that adds an unexpected and credible detail to the narrative. And then, of course, we need to understand that the tomb's location was known. The tomb wasn't a secretive or anonymous burial place, but a specific, identifiable location near Jerusalem. According to the Gospels, it was a new tomb that was hewn from rock, and it was situated in a garden that was close to the site of the crucifixion. John 19:41 and 42. Now, this proximity and visibility meant that both Jesus' followers and his critics knew where he was buried. If the resurrection had been fabricated, It would have been an easy matter for skeptics to inspect the tomb and expose the falsehood if the body was still there. The fact that Christianity began and spread in the same region where Jesus was crucified and where he was buried underscores the implausibility of a hoax about the tomb's emptiness. And then also there's a seal and a guarded tomb. The tomb was not only well known, but was also sealed and guarded by Roman soldiers, as recorded in Matthew 27:65 and 66. The Jewish leaders were aware of Jesus' predictions that he would rise on the third day. And keep that in mind, because Jesus, some people say, well, it was all made up afterwards. No, Jesus predicted his resurrection many times. But because he had predicted his resurrection many times, the Jewish Sanhedrin that was opposed to him, for the most part, requested that a precaution be put in place, that guards be placed on the tomb, not temple guards, not Hebrew temple guards, but rather a Roman guard, and a seal be placed on the tomb. Now, Roman guards were highly disciplined, and the penalty for the dereliction of duty was severe. It could mean crucifixion for them. I know Romans in normal society, Roman citizens were exempt from crucifixion, but soldiers were not. They were often crucified as a result of their dereliction of duty. So they would not have fallen asleep, like the narrative says, that was a plot to. No, we'll get to that in just a moment. But it makes it unlikely that they would neglect their responsibilities. Let's just put it that way. The sealing of the tomb with a Roman seal was a formal act of authority, and it symbolized that the tomb was under an official protection. And ironically, these measures that were intended to discredit any claims of the resurrection ended up strengthening the case for the resurrection. The presence of guards and a seal made it impossible for Jesus' followers or anyone else to steal the body without detection. The empty tomb, therefore, became a powerful testament to the reality of the resurrection. There was no plausible natural explanation for the body's absence. It wasn't stolen. This historical detail about Jesus' burial forms a foundational argument that the resurrection could not have been fabricated. The involvement of Joseph of Arimathea, the tomb's public and accessible location, and the security measures that had been taken by authority all point to the authenticity of the burial account and provide a compelling evidence for the empty tomb and the resurrection of Jesus. But then we also have eyewitness testimony. Now, the women were the first to come to the tomb and realized that the tomb was empty. The Gospels unanimously record that the women, including Mary Magdalene, were the first to discover the empty tomb. You can look at that in Luke, the 24th chapter, verses 1 through 3, John 20 and verse 1. In the context of the first century culture, this detail is actually remarkable because a woman's testimony was not considered reliable in legal or public settings. They were often dismissed as untrustworthy witnesses. If the resurrection were a fabricated story that was designed to persuade skeptics, the authors would have logically chosen men, preferably well-known, respected figures like Peter and John as the first witnesses to lend credibility to the claims that the tomb was empty. The fact that the gospel writers recorded women as the first witnesses, despite the cultural stigma, strongly supports the authenticity of that narrative. It demonstrates a commitment to truth, even when the truth might seem counterproductive to their goal of convincing others. Now, the reaction of the women further underscores the credibility of the account. They did not immediately declare Jesus' resurrection with certainty. Instead, their initial response was one of confusion and fear and even disbelief. They thought someone had taken Jesus' body, John 20 and verse 2. Their bewilderment and their lack of understanding align with their human experience. Dead people don't come up out of the grave. An unexpected, unprecedented event would have to evoke those kind of reactions. The body is no longer in the tomb. And this raw, unembellished portrayal of their emotions actually adds to the narrative and its authenticity. It shows that they were not anticipating the resurrection despite Jesus' prior predictions, and their eventual proclamation of the risen Christ came only after personal encounters and further confirmation. The inclusion of women as the first eyewitnesses and their genuine human reaction reflect the historical reliability of the resurrection accounts. Now, these details, far from being fabricated, reveal a narrative that's rooted in real events that challenged and reshaped the expectations of those who experienced them. And then, of course, you have the response of the authorities, the admission of an empty tomb. The reaction of the Jewish leaders to the empty tomb is recorded in Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15. When they were informed by the guards about the tomb's condition, they did not attempt to deny the reality of the empty tomb. Instead, they devised a plan to explain it away and to bribe the guards to spread the story that the disciples had stolen the body during the night. Now, this response is highly significant because it indirectly confirms that the tomb was indeed empty. If the body of Jesus had been in the tomb, I promise you, the authorities would have easily squashed any claims of the resurrection. They would have took the body of Jesus and nailed it to the walls of Jerusalem to prove that he had not risen from the dead. I know that's sort of grotesque, but still, they would have done that to disprove the resurrection. But they couldn't produce a body. They couldn't produce a body for public view. Their failure to do so and their reliance on a fabricated explanation serves as an admission that they could not account for the missing body. And then, of course, there's the failed counter-narrative, the stolen body story. While it tended to actually discredit the resurrection, it inherently is self-defeating. By promoting the narrative, the Jewish leaders unintentionally validated the most critical component of the resurrection claim. The tomb was empty, and Jesus' body was no longer there. In addition to that, the suggestion that the disciples, an unarmed, demoralized group of fishermen and followers, could overpower Roman guards and orchestrate a theft under such heavy scrutiny strains credibility itself. It also fails to account for the transformation of the disciples who went from fearful and disheartened to bold proclaimers of the resurrection, willing to face persecution and even death for their testimony. The stolen body does not address those realities, and ultimately, the stolen body theory reinforces the plausibility of the resurrection. The actions of the authorities, including their acknowledgement of the empty tomb and their flawed counter-narrative, bolster the historical credibility of the resurrection. Their attempts to suppress the truth only highlight the difficulty of refuting the reality of an empty tomb. But there are alternative theories regarding the missing body. There's the stolen body theory. Now, the tomb where Jesus was buried was secured by these trained Roman soldiers, as recorded in Matthew 27, 65, and 66. These guards were highly disciplined professionals, and their failure to perform their duty could result in their own execution under Roman law. I've already talked about Roman soldiers could be executed by virtue of crucifixion. Roman citizens could not, but Roman soldiers could. The suggestion that Jesus' disciple, an unarmed, disorganized group, could overpower or evade these soldiers without leaving any evidence or recorded struggle, it's unbelievable. No, it's implausible. The presence of these guards was deliberate. It was a deliberate measure to prevent tampering and to make the body secure. The stolen body theory is untenable. The disciples' fear, when you look at the disciples, their fear after Jesus' arrest, the disciples were in hiding. They were overwhelmed with fear and despair. John 20 and verse 19 describes them as hiding behind locked doors for fear of the Jewish authorities. Basically, they were thinking, if they did this to Jesus, they can surely do it to us. Far from being an emboldened group of conspirators that were capable of overpowering these Roman soldiers or even going to the tomb to try to sneak the body out, that becomes unrealistic. They were a frightened group struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The idea that these terrified individuals could actually summon the courage and the tactical skill to plan and execute a heist of that body under those circumstances, that defies logic and contradicts the recorded state of their minds. Then there's the motivation. The disciples had no conceivable motive to fake the resurrection. Unlike many fabricated religious movements, they were not seeking power or wealth or status. Proclaiming the resurrection brought them no worldly gain. It brought only persecution and suffering and martyrdom. Historically, people may sacrifice their lives for something they genuinely believe to be true, even if they are mistaken. However, it is unfathomable that individuals would willingly suffer and die for something they knew to be a lie. If they had stolen the body, would you die for that? Would you die for that, to launch a religion that was actually outlawed and illegal and would make you no money and give you no power, no prestige, no pomp, no circumstance? Would you do that? No one would. That lack of motive makes the stolen body theory absolutely improbable and unbelievable. Later, their martyrdom, the ultimate rebuttal to the stolen body theory, is the willingness of all the disciples to endure torture and even die for their testimony about the resurrection of Jesus. Bartholomew, according to tradition, was filleted or skinned alive. All of them died martyrs' deaths with the exception of John. And they boiled him in oil, but he wouldn't die. And they exiled him to the Isle of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation, at least, and possibly his epistles. Many of those who were not just apostles, but those who were writers of the gospel, were also executed for refusing to recant their belief that Jesus had risen from the dead. How could they? If they actually saw him alive from the dead, how could they recant that? Their willingness to face death is a profound testament to their conviction that they had seen and experienced the risen Christ. The stolen body theory fails to account for the historical and psychological realities that surrounded the resurrection. The presence of Roman guards, the disciples' initial fear, their lack of motive, and their ultimate willingness to die for their belief all point to the authenticity of the resurrection rather than a fabricated conspiracy. Of course, there's another theory, and that's the wrong tomb theory. I've already touched on the fact that everybody knew where the tomb was. But the suggestion that the women and the disciples and anyone else that was connected to this resurrection story mistakenly went to the wrong tomb, that's implausible. I mean, given that the tomb belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent and respected member of the Jewish council, his association with the burial ensured that the location of the tomb was well known not only to Jesus' followers, but also to the Jewish leaders and the Roman authorities. The burial site was in close proximity to Jerusalem and was identifiable by nature. It was close to where Jesus was crucified. It's described as a new tomb that was hewn out of rock. And that eliminates the possibility of confusion about where it was located. Matthew 27 and verse 60. There was public verification. If the resurrection claims were based on an era, whether it be the stolen body or some other event that might be suggested, such a visiting the wrong tomb, that wouldn't have happened. It would have been easy for the Jewish leaders or the Roman authorities to disprove that claim by simply pointing to the correct tomb where the body of Jesus would have still been present. The fact that they did not do so and instead resorted to fabricating a story about the disciples stealing the body underscores that the tomb in question was indeed empty. The absence of Jesus' body was a fact that both his followers and his opponents had to grapple with, making the wrong tomb theory untenable. The gospel accounts describe how the women who came to the tomb were met by angels who proclaimed, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen." Luke 24, 5 and 6. Now, this angelic message provides divine confirmation that the empty tomb was not a result of human error, but part of God's plan to demonstrate the resurrection. The women's astonishment and subsequent report to the disciples further affirms that they were at the correct location and that the empty tomb had profound supernatural implications. The wrong tomb theory fails to explain evidence surrounding the resurrection. The well-documented location of the tomb, the inability of the authorities to refute the claim by presenting Jesus' body, and the divine testimony of angels all point to the reality of the resurrection rather than a case of mistaken identity. Someone actually suggested grave robbery. Now, let's take a quick look at it. It's not worth a lot of time. The Jewish authorities and the Roman officials had no reason to steal Jesus' body. Their primary goal was to actually suppress the emerging Christian movement, which was viewed as a threat to both the religious and the political arenas that they were a part of. It threatened the stability of those groups politically and religiously. Removing the body would have simply risked creating an unnecessary speculation or unintentionally validating Jesus' prediction about his rising from the dead. The Jewish leaders had even gone to great length to secure the tomb by requesting Roman guards to prevent tampering. It's illogical to suggest that they would undermine their own precautions by orchestrating the theft of the body. And some people have even suggested, well, it was just grave robbers trying to steal the body for whatever riches he was buried with. He had no riches. I'm sure if it was thieves who had somehow got past the Roman guards and gotten into the tomb, would have inspected the body and realized there's no wealth here. There's no rings, there's no jewelry, there's no anything, just the body of a crucified man. So it doesn't hold water. Now, failure to produce the body, that's big. If the Jewish or Roman authorities had taken Jesus' body, they could have easily and decisively debunked the resurrection claim by simply producing that body. This would have immediately discredited the disciples' testimony that Jesus had risen from the dead and halted the spread of Christianity in its infancy. It would have never got off the ground. But despite their vested interest in stopping the movement, they never presented Jesus' body. The absence of that action is compelling evidence that they did not have possession of it, leaving the empty tomb as an undeniable reality that even Jesus' enemies could not explain away. The idea of grave robbery by Jesus' enemies is inconsistent, or grave robbery by anyone is inconsistent with the testimony that he had risen from the dead. And their lack of motive and inability to produce a body further affirms the authenticity of the empty tomb and the resurrection narrative. There's another theory that's out there called the swoon theory. And although the swoon theory suggests that Jesus did not truly die, but merely fainted and later revived in the tomb, this idea fails under scrutiny for several compelling reasons. First, we need to realize Romans were good at their job. Roman soldiers were highly trained in the art of execution, particularly crucifixion. Their procedures ensured that the condemned individuals were unquestionably dead before removal from the cross. In Jesus' case, his death was further confirmed when a Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear, producing that flow of blood and water that John records in John 19:33 and 34. The separation of blood and water, or plasma, is a physiological indicator of death. It's caused by the cessation of circulation and the onset of postmortem changes. And this act, combined with the soldier's assurance to Pilate that Jesus was in fact dead, which you can read about in Mark 15:44 and 45, leaves no room for doubt about his death on the cross. He did not swoon. Then, of course, there's, again, the tomb security. Even if Jesus had somehow survived the crucifixion, the idea that he could have revived in the cool of the tomb after 3 days of no water, no food, and then escaped by rolling away a 1,000+ pound stone that had been rolled in front of the door after being scourged and crucified, that kind of traumatic event, there's no way could have ever even got out of the tomb. He would have been far too weak to roll away that stone, and he would have died in the tomb, even if he did swoon on the cross. He died on that cross, and the soldiers knew it. The swoon theory is completely inconsistent with both the historical evidence and the physiological realities of crucifixion. It fails to account for the Roman confirmation of Jesus' death, the security of the tomb, and the transformative power of his post-resurrection appearances. Instead, the evidence strongly supports that Jesus truly died. He was buried, and he did rise on the third day. Then, of course, there's another aspect that I believe is a small evidence, but still a good evidence that there was no stolen body by the disciples. And that's the race to the tomb. The account of Peter and John running to the tomb after hearing Mary Magdalene's report offers further evidence of the disciples' genuine shock and lack of premeditated involvement in Jesus' resurrection. If they had stolen the body, surely Peter and John, that inner circle, Peter, James, and John, surely Peter and John would have known about that event, participated in that event, and yet when they heard the story from Mary Magdalene that the tomb was empty, why the race? Why wouldn't they just simply wink at one another and say, yeah, we're good, we know about that? They didn't. Their actions and the details are observed within the Gospel of John as an authentic response to an unexpected and extraordinary event. And then, of course, you've got to look at Mary Magdalene's report. Mary Magdalene's initial reaction upon discovering the empty tomb was not to assume that Jesus had risen from the dead, but to conclude that the body had been taken by someone. She actually said, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him," John 20 and verse 2. Her statement actually reflects a lack of expectation for the resurrection among even Jesus' closest followers. If the resurrection were a fabricated story, it would have been unlikely for the narrative to include this initial misunderstanding, as it shows that they had a genuine confusion about what had happened and surprise in regard to it. Peter and John's urgency, once they had raced to the tomb upon hearing Mary's report, they run to that tomb, and their urgency reflects shock, concern, and a deep desire to understand what had happened. John, being the younger and the faster, actually arrives first, but hesitated at the entrance. Peter, known for his boldness, entered into the tomb without hesitation. Now, their actions underscore their unplanned and sincere reaction to the news, and it further disproves any notion of prior knowledge or conspiracy. And then, of course, there's evidence within the tomb. On the inside, Peter observes the linen clothes that had wrapped Jesus' body lying undisturbed, and the head covering folded neatly in a separate place, John 20, 6 and 7. Now, these details are significant. If the body had been stolen, thieves would not have taken the time to carefully unwrap the body, let alone fold the head covering neatly. The state of the burial clothes suggests that not only that the body was not stolen, but that something miraculous had occurred. This scene points to the resurrection rather than to human interference. The race to the tomb and the evidence found within it highlight the disciples' authentic and unprepared reaction to the empty tomb. Their confusion and their urgency and the remarkable details they observed strongly support the reality of a resurrection rather than any alternate explanation. And then, of course, there's eyewitness testimonies. The resurrection of Jesus is supported by multiple independent eyewitness accounts, which provide a compelling basis for historicity. These testimonies include diverse appearances, physical encounters, consistent narratives, and a dramatic transformation of skeptics into devoted believers. There's a variety of appearances. Jesus appeared to a wide range of individuals and groups in different contexts. He was seen by Mary Magdalene near the tomb, by the disciples behind closed doors, by two men on the road to Emmaus, and by more than 500 people at once, according to 1 Corinthians 15, verses 5 through 8. Now, these appearances occurred in various settings, both private and public, intimate and communal. The diversity of these encounters makes it improbable that they were all fabricated or even hallucinated. The consistency of those visions across so many different circumstances that defies explanation by natural means. And then there's the physical encounters, the eyewitnesses. They consistently describe their interactions with the risen Christ as a physical and tangible thing, not ethereal or imagined. Jesus invited Thomas to touch his wounds, John 20 and verse 27, to dispel any doubt. He ate with his disciples to demonstrate his physical presence, Luke 24, 41 through 43. These encounters were not fleeting or ambiguous, but involved extended conversations and actions that provided undeniable proof of his bodily resurrection. And there's consistency when it comes to the accounts. The accounts of the resurrection vary in detail, but they're all consistent in their core elements: the empty tomb, Jesus' physical appearances, and his interactions with his followers. These differences actually reflect personal perspectives of the witnesses themselves, and it adds to their credibility. Fabricated stories typically show signs of rehearsed uniformity, but the Gospels and other New Testament writings display a genuine blend of shared facts and individual recollections. The resurrection also transformed skeptics into fervent believers. James was the brother of Jesus, but initially he was skeptical of Jesus' ministry. He didn't believe it. He actually went down with the family and said, "He's lost his mind. Let's collect him and take him home." But he became a leader in the early church after encountering the risen Christ himself, Acts 15 and verse 13. Paul was a zealous persecutor of Christians. He experienced a life-changing vision of the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, Acts 9, verses 1 through 6. That individual changed from one who was persecuting the church to one who was supporting and probably the greatest advocate of Christ and his church. Now, these dramatic shifts in belief and behavior are difficult to explain apart from the reality of the resurrection. Both James and Paul endured persecution and eventually martyrdom, and it tests to the depths of their conviction. The eyewitness testimonies provide a compelling foundation for the resurrection. The variety of appearances, the physical evidence, the consistency of accounts, and the transformation of skeptics combine together to form a powerful and credible case that Jesus truly rose from the dead. Now, some people have actually even put forth an hallucination theory. They say that the 500, they all wanted to see Christ resurrected, so there was a group hallucination, a mass hallucination of a resurrected Jesus. Hallucinations are by definition personal, subjective experiences that occur in the mind of an individual. The notion that 500 people could simultaneously experience the same hallucination, that defies psychological and medical understanding. Hallucinations do not occur in mass or in such a coordinated and consistent manner across diverse groups and contexts. It doesn't happen like that. And even if 500 people all had the same hallucination, it would not account for the empty tomb and the failure of the Romans and the Jews to produce the dead body of Christ. No way to get around that. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is compelling, and it's undeniable. The empty tomb, the urgency of Peter and John to investigate that empty tomb, the consistent eyewitness testimonies, the radical transformation of the disciples, the inability of skeptics to disprove these events all lead to one inescapable conclusion: Jesus Christ is risen. If this is true, it's not just an historical fact, it's a call to action. Just as John saw the evidence and believed, we too are called to respond in faith to the risen Christ. The resurrection is more than an event in history. It's an invitation to a new life that's filled with hope and purpose and the promise of everlasting life. So what will your response be? Will you accept the risen Savior and the new life that he offers you? The invitation's for you now. Jesus is risen. That changes everything. The question for us is, do we believe it? Do we really believe it? I want to thank you for joining us today on The Preacher Online. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is life-changing. And if you've been encouraged, challenged, or blessed by the message, we'd love to hear from you. If you haven't already, make sure again that you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Share this message with your friends, with your family, with anyone who needs to hear this truth about Christ. Your support helps us spread the good news far and wide. Let us know in the comments section where you've been watching from and what topics you'd like to cover in future episodes. We'd love to hear from you, and we want to address any questions or issues that matter most to you. Here at The Preacher Online, we're all about going back to the Bible, to be Christians and only Christians, nothing more, nothing less, and nothing else. We focused on being undenominational. The church in the first century was one church. They believed one thing. That's what we need to be today. Until next time, remember, Jesus is risen, and that changes everything. God bless you. We'll see you again next week.